Hello and welcome. My name is Jenna Flanagan. I'm the host of the WNET Group's award-winning multi-platform news magazine, Metro Focus. The WNET Group is home to Channel 13, America's flagship PBS station located in New York City, and 13 airs Metro Focus 7 nights a week. Now, on behalf of everyone here, thank you for joining us for the opening night of Close to Home, Town Halls on Housing Equality. Each week, we will gather with frontline thinkers and doers to examine an array of complex topics such as housing and economic justice, food sovereignty and security, homelessness and community cultural displacement, and media narratives about housing. The summit will present frank talk about issues and solutions with an understanding of history and eyes towards the future. Close to Home is taping live every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern from April 26th to May 24th. Learn more at 13.org/close to home. Now, tonight's program, The Cost of Living, a town hall about housing and economic justice, is presented by the WNET Group and Chasing the Dream, our national multi-platform reporting initiative that explores inequality, opportunity, and justice in America. You can watch the programs produced by Chasing the Dream at pbs.org/chasing the dream or at youtube.com/onthebrinkpbs. Please subscribe. Part of our station's mission is to provide meaningful experiences to our audiences and communities to educate, entertain, and inspire. By bringing together leaders who are at the front lines of creating housing equality, we hope that Close to Home will provide new perspectives and ideas for strengthening and enlivening all of our communities. We have a time for audience questions, Q&A, towards the end. So as you watch the live stream, please post your questions in the comments section. And please join us again next Thursday for part 2 of this series, Circle Made of Soil, a town hall about food sovereignty and security. Learn more at 13.org/close to home. And now I'd like to thank our promotional partners for tonight's episode of Close to Home. We're grateful for the support of Chaya CDC, Dreams of Detroit Community Justice Project, the Asian Community Development Corporation, and the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development. Thank you also to our ASL interpreters for tonight, Avery Gordon and Bob Laparo. Last, a very special thanks to WNET's 400-plus community partners. Their input has shaped our thinking around this topic and many others. A quick reminder that the views expressed by tonight's guests and attendees are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views of the WNET Group. And now, I'm pleased to introduce WNET's Director of Community Partnerships and the Curator of Close to Home, Brian Tate.
Thank you so much, Jenna, and greetings, everyone. I'd like to also thank an additional partner for tonight, NeighborWorks America. Now, I want to begin by acknowledging and paying deep respect to the Lenape people upon whose unceded and ancestral homeland lies the city we call Manhattan. Please join me in making this affirmation from a place of humility and solidarity with an ongoing commitment to racial justice and decolonization. I want to also acknowledge the continuity between our being here tonight and the struggle for liberation and the full expression of our humanity, which has transcended generations. Many lives have been lost in this struggle to forces of hate and racism, fascism. We hold all those people close. We honor them each time we gather across communities to speak truth and create change. I want to now welcome all of you for joining us for the first night of this 5-week summit, Close to Home, Town Halls on Housing Equality. We've been working on this for months, and we're just thrilled to be able to share it with you now. Each time that we hold these town halls, this is our 3rd year doing this, each time we hold these town halls, we start with a brief performance by a gifted musician or spoken word artist to gather us across this virtual space and remind us why we have come together to have these tough conversations is for the culture. And we're very excited to have a special guest to help kick off this 5-week summit tonight. Please join me in welcoming the Executive Director of Just Media, the Artistic Director of Urban Word NYC, and the inaugural Poet in Residence of Lincoln Center, Mahogany L. Brown.
Hello.
Mahogany, it's great to see you. Thank you so much for being here. As someone who wears a few hats now and then, I appreciate that you wear many hats and you wear them so well.
Oh, thank you. Appreciate that, Ryan.
Where are you joining us from tonight?
I'm joining you live from Brooklyn, New York.
Excellent. I'm in Brooklyn.
I can tell.
Right.
Sounds good.
The soundtrack, exactly.
Exactly.
I love all the boroughs, but I will confide that I think Brooklyn is the most awesome. Okay, Mahogany, you've agreed to read 2 pieces for us, which we're just really happy about. What can you tell us? What's the title of this first piece?
The first poem I'll be sharing is called Black Girl Magic, and I believe it speaks for itself. So thank you for letting me share. It's all about reclamation of space, and this is for us.
Excellent. We look forward.
They say you ain't supposed to be here, Black girl. You ain't supposed to wear red lipstick. You ain't supposed to wear high heels. You ain't supposed to smile in public. You ain't supposed to smile nowhere, Black girl. You ain't supposed to be no more than a girlfriend. You ain't supposed to get married. You ain't supposed to want no dream that big. You ain't supposed to dream at all. You ain't supposed to do nothing but carry babies and carry felons and carry weaves and carry silence and carry families and carry confusion and carry a nation, but never an opinion. Because you ain't supposed to have nothing to say, Black girl, not unless it's a joke. Because you ain't supposed to love yourself, Black girl. You ain't supposed to find nothing worth saving in all that brown. You ain't supposed to know that Tina, Beyonce, Cicely, Shonda, Rhymes, shine, 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 Black girl. You ain't supposed to love your mind. You ain't supposed to love. You ain't supposed to be loved up on. You only supposed to pose. Voodoo child, vixen style. You're supposed to pop out babies and hide the stretch marks. You're supposed to be still. So still they think you statue. So still they think you chalked outline. So still they keep thinking you stone. Until you look more Medusa than Viola Davis. Until you sound more Shanae than Kerry Washington. Until you're more side-eyed than Michelle Obama on a Tuesday, but you tell them you are more than a hot comb in a washing set. You are Kunta Kinte's kin. You are a Black girl worth remembering. You are a threat knowing yourself. You are a threat loving yourself. You are a threat loving your kin. You are a threat loving your children. You Black girl magic. You Black girl fly. You Black girl bring. You Black girl wonder. You Black girl shine. You Black girl bloom. You Black girl, and you turning into a beautiful Black woman right before our eyes. Thank you.
Power. Such power. Thank you, Mahogany, for getting us started this way.
Thank
Means
you.
everything. Please tell us, what's the title of the second piece that you'll grace us with?
The second piece I will share is a poem that I was asked to write responding to the 2017 election. So this is called If 2017 Was a Poem title.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks. 1. When they turn bodegas into boutique grocery stores. When they bounce cops up the block like this hipster protection program won't turn back Left Rack into Harlem, won't turn back Bed-Stuy into Brownsville, turn Brownsville back into the Bronx, back into Gaza, back. You will taste this strange and bitter American history, where the mom and pop work more hours than the governor, where the pesticides overflow our sewer systems, float our neighborhoods until food deserts, one way in, one way out. Tell me this gentrification be for my own good. Tell me this housing project keep us warfare ready. Tell me Biggie died for our sins and I'll show you a Brooklyn stoop with the baby's name etched in chalk, a hashtag ghost gone already, a price tag on his sister's face. She's been missing since Sunday, where chopper lights paint concrete a trail of breadcrumbs. The haunting finds its way back to our homes, one. The Electoral College is a lullaby designed to put us back to sleep, one. The ocean is weeping, a righteous rage. She got questions for the living. And what about the sweetheart who would grow to love Tamir Rice, Mike Brown, Corinne Gaines, Akai Gurley? What about they mamas singing their name before each breakfast? Or their church praying for the redemption, Bibles raised in the air? What about they almost children? How about they daddy smile? What about they name make them so easy to turn to ash? How we ghosting black boys for the toys we gift them? One. Yo, America. What you know about Noose Ready? What you know about chalk lines and double barrels? What you know about a murder weapon or a loose cigarette or a baby sleeping on a couch? What you know about the flag? The Confederate fathers that followed me down a lonely road in Georgia, the names that I rolled off my tongue in prayer: Saint Sojourner, Saint Harriet, Saint Rakia, Saint Sandra, bring me home. Or leave me steady, gun aimed and cocked ready. Call it what it is. Post-traumatic slave syndrome. Call it land tax until homelessness. Call it abortion turned sterilization. Ain't no lie. Like the one against our stillborn children. Ain't no lie. Like the many that shaped our babies into mute cattle. Prison industrial complex reverberates in the tune of elementary. Fourth graders are their easiest targets. One, a math problem. If one woman got a 7 Mac 11 and 2 heaters for the Beamer, how many Congress seats will the NRA lose? How many votes will it take for a sexual predator to lift the White House off her feet? One. I am practicing this aim. My tongue a shoestring strafe. My tongue say melt the wires of Guantanamo. Yasin Bey coming home ain't what we thought it would be. Ain't no solace in Mecca. Even Spike Lee left Brooklyn. Here, a slumlord will leave my front steps full of rat piss and Airbnb my neighbor's apartment for double my take-home pay. Unhinge the city of Rikers. Bring back the Reapers. Give them the loot and the stoop. Yeah, they're good at killing, but so was Jefferson. I mean, Washington. I mean, CIA. I mean, COINTELPRO. I mean, they mimic your grace. I mean, it's 2017, 2018, 19, 2020, 21, 22, 23. America. A new year. And your facelift be botched. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahogany. My gosh, such power, such important power lifting us up right now and holding us close. Greatly appreciated. People, if you all love Mahogany's work as much as we did, you can learn more about her and what she's doing at her website, Mo Brown, MOBROWNE, MoBrown.com. Mahogany, thank you again. Everyone, please join. As Mahogany and I were discussing, I'm in Brooklyn, and there's a little bit of noise. That's the nature of things. Very lively. Please join me now in welcoming tonight's incredible panel for The Cost of Living, a town hall about housing and economic justice. You can find everyone's full bios at 13.org/close to home. And I think that link will also be put in the chat where you're watching. And remember that the panel will be taking your questions too. So please drop those in the same chat. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our moderator for tonight, my friend Annetta Ciceron, Executive Director, Chaya CDC, based in Queens, New York. Annetta, great to see you.
Thank you, Brian. Thank you. And I want to say Queens will give you some competition.
I understand. It's a New York City thing. I understand. And our panelists, Mark Crane, Executive Director, Dream of Detroit. Great to see you, Mark.
Great to be here.
Alana Greer, Director and Co-Founder, Community Justice Project in Miami.
Hello.
Hello. From Boston, Angie Liu, Executive Director, Asian Community Development Corporation.
Good evening.
Good evening. Here in New York City, Barika X. Williams, Executive Director, Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development.
Evening, everybody.
And last but not least, Mel Willie of the Navajo Nation, Director of Native Strategy and Partnerships, NeighborWorks America, based in Washington, D.C. Mel,
hello, everyone.
Thank you all so much for being here. Annetta, turning it over to you. Looking forward to a great conversation. I'll see you back in about an hour.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Brian. I want to thank you and Jasmine Wilson and PBS for your vision and efforts to make this conversation possible. April is Fair Housing Month, and this year, 2023, marks the 55th anniversary of the Fair Housing Act. But as we all know, access to safe, affordable housing for BIPOC communities is anything but fair. In fact, Black and Brown communities continue to suffer tremendously from a legacy of redlining, are disproportionately housing insecure, contending with skyrocketing rents, homeownership opportunities not designed for us, and simply out of reach for a growing number of our community members. Not to mention displacement, gentrification, and climate gentrification. There is also no doubt that the pandemic has amplified many of these issues. Yet in this terrible picture, there are bright lights, building power and hope across our country. I am delighted to have the opportunity to sit and have this conversation with some of my friends in the fight for housing and economic justice, who are some of the brightest lights in the movement. So, Alana and Barika, you both lead organizations that are supporting housing and economic justice work on the ground across diverse demographics, which give you a deep insight on the housing affordability challenges facing our Black and Brown communities. Tell us from your perspective what you see are some of the most pressing issues. Barika, why don't we start with you?
Hi, everybody. My name is Barika Williams. I'm the executive director of the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and we are a almost 50-year-old nonprofit organization that is created to win affordable housing and ensure economic opportunity across all of New York City neighborhoods. So we work in all 5 boroughs. All of them are part of our community. And just want to say thank you to PBS for hosting this. I think what we're seeing as this some of the most pressing housing issues right now is how clear we have gotten in terms of a housing crisis across all neighborhoods here in New York City. But really, I think this is an issue countrywide, as I think Alana will speak to as well. It's not just New York. And I think what we're really seeing and understanding is that the housing market was really never created for people of color, for folks from marginalized backgrounds, whether that's LGBTQ, whether that's women-led households, like all of these different pieces and elements. And really that the housing market was very much rooted in white supremacy and patriarchy. And it is designed to support and sort of uplift a very traditional Western white, like nuclear family dynamic. And the truth is that isn't a lot of who we are. For some of us in some of our communities is never who we've been. And so many of our BIPOC communities, our immigrant communities, have been in an utter crisis in their housing market for decades. And now we are at the place where that housing crisis has really caught up with everybody else, that we're seeing white middle-class families and households, be them renters, be them homeowners, really struggling to participate and engage in the housing market in a way that feels stabilizing and secure. And so now the conversation has been, what do we do writ large? Rents are increasing in New York City at 30% year on year. Folks can't afford to find a home in order to buy. You've got to have, average homeownership prices are upwards passing $250,000 here in New York City. And that's for a condo or a co-op, folks. That's not for like a big home reference for other places in the country. And so what does that look like in terms of something that is sustainable for families and for individuals, let alone our communities, especially our most marginalized communities, going forward and over time?
Alana Greer here in Miami. I think the obviously the most pressing thing we hear and see in the headlines every day and hear from folks at the doors is the rent crisis, is these folks being pushed out of communities that their families have been in for generations because of the forces of development and profiteering. But the reality is that these are not new crises. These are not issues that folks in our community are seeing for the first time. They have been struggling through these storms well before COVID, well before the changes in the economy, well before the hurricanes that have impacted us here in Florida. And the reality is, I think what we're facing is a crisis of tenant power versus corporate profiteers, speculators, and really trying to maintain a status quo that benefits these large corporations over everyday people, and that's maintaining and worsening this housing crisis. Here in Florida, we have seen over the last year incredible examples of organizing for our partners like the Miami Workers Center and Florida Rising and tenant unions across the state. They won tenant rights ordinances in 16 different cities and counties. They won a ballot measure for rent stabilization. And each and every one of those have been met with millions of dollars in corporate lobbying, in investments, in taking away the power of everyday people. Right now, we just had this morning our legislature vote to null and void all of those ordinances out. And we're really, I think, seeing the results of that in people's rent bills that are coming due next week, right? And if we don't reckon with that crisis, we don't reckon with the imbalance of power that our economy has created, that capitalism has created, and the racial capitalism that is in play there, I think we're just going to be at new iterations of these housing crises over and over again.
Mel and Angie, we know that the Native and Asian communities are tremendously diverse with vastly different histories, rural versus urban, some with land, others without. Yet the mainstream narrative is that we are a monolith. Can you tell us how housing issues are playing out differently for the different constituencies with which you work?
Sure. Mel Willie with NeighborWorks America. I'm the director of Native Strategy. Thank you for that question. I think it's really important to understand, yes, in Indian country, tribal communities are diverse. We have tribes, about 574 federally recognized tribes across the United States, in addition to those state recognized tribes that are across the country. One thing to remember is that there's no set kind of specific solution to all of the housing issues that exist in tribal communities. A lot of tribal people, one thing is that they are displaced. In some tribal areas, we have tribal land areas and tribal reservations where it's very difficult to get any loans, and lending is almost non-existent. And we have tribes where tribal people have been forced relocated by federal policy to urban areas and been completely displaced and creating communities. But what's beautiful about that is that tribal people are resilient and that they're coming together and creating solutions that are locally driven. A big point of demarcation for Native people is in the 1960s and 70s was the proliferation of tribal self-determination programs within the federal government. So right now we have the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act, which was passed in the late 90s and put into operation as 1998. And this is where tribes are given a block grant by the federal government to create their own housing programs. And those housing programs are responsive to their needs. And so you'll see the difference in the way that those programs are operated, that they're meeting the unique needs of the tribal community. So whether a tribe needs to have additional rental assistance, whether they need to have supportive housing, or if the tribe is looking at home ownership and lending, those needs are made. That's what I think is the beauty about the law. Unfortunately, the allocation of federal funds for that program through the Indian Housing Block Grant has been stagnant since it's first been allocated funds in 1998, and so the buying power of that money has diminished. And we all know, all of us are housers, that when you build a new house, you have to maintain and operate that rental unit, and those costs can be expensive. And so right now we're seeing that a lot of tribes across the United States are just getting enough money to maintain the rental units that they have built. And so there's no new money for new housing units to be built. So we have to look at leveraging those federal funds. And that's where the work that I do in building partnerships with tribal communities to build leveraging the federal investment with lending institutions, nonprofit organizations, so that federal dollar is expanded to provide for greater use for housing services in tribal communities.
Thank you. Angie?
Yeah, thank you, Netta, for that question. And Mel, it's really interesting to hear and learn about in your communities, the different issues. So the term and even the concept of Asian Americans is a relatively new one that did not come about until 1960s, 1970s. And one could argue that that label has not come altogether naturally, because when you think about it, it is an overarching label that spans a really large continent that spans well more than 20 countries of origin, ethnicities. So the diversity of this community oftentimes gets flattened in many of the data collection that we have seen, because Asian Americans is still a relatively small group in America. Oftentimes we see in data there could be white, Black, Latinx/Hispanic, but a lot of times the Asian category gets left out altogether. And even when it is a single monolithic label called Asian, and it flattens and disregards all those diverse socioeconomic differences within our community. What I like to often point to is that there was a Pew report from a few years ago that points out that Asian Americans are the fastest growing group in America, but we also have the greatest income disparity. So we have some of the wealthiest folks, but we also have folks at the very bottom of the economic totem pole. And so how that has played out, even just locally in Boston, where my organization serves primarily low-income Asian immigrants with limited English proficiency, is oftentimes we have to make the case to funders and external parties, because the impression is, well, I see Chinese people from overseas coming to my neighborhood and buying up houses with all cash, and they have PhDs and well-paid jobs. So why do you need services? And why do you need assistance for housing? And that misconception, what it disregards is that depending on how different groups have come to this country, their immigration pathways or their family histories, people arrived in this country in very, very different circumstances. Certainly, certain Asian groups and immigrants have come to this country on professional visas, for higher education, because that is how our immigration system is set up, right? It has these systems set up to try to attract elite, professional, highly educated people to come over as talent. But we also have folks coming over to this country when they are fleeing war and violence as refugees looking for asylum, or really seeking a better economic circumstances in this country. And so part of what we have been really working on is trying to fight for data equity and data disaggregation, not only in housing data, but across major socioeconomic and health data to show the breadth and diversity of our community, but also to be able to better pinpoint where the needs are, and so we can better target those resources.
Yeah, thank you, Angie. And I really appreciate you raising the data issue. I think that is such a fundamental problem across the board, and especially when it comes to housing. So thank you all so much for those introductory comments. I think that's really laid a good foundation for our conversation. I want to move into this issue of affordability, because I think that is so central, right, to the problem that we are talking about. So Angie, going back to you again, and bringing in Mark, both of your organizations do incredible work reclaiming homes in your communities. Angie, you and I talked about naturally occurring affordable housing. And Mark, I know you're doing incredible work on community land trusts and holistic housing development. Ultimately, both of those areas are about permanent affordability. Tell us more about these models for long-term affordability and why are they so important?
Sure. Thank you, Aneta.
Start with Mark.
Yeah, happy to jump in. And thanks again for having us here. So in Detroit, we deal with a number of issues that, as folks have said, are prevalent across the country. But, in particular, what we've had to deal with is the loss of dignity that comes from having 100,000 homes driven into property tax foreclosure in the last decade. Tens of thousands of those homes taken from people after they were overassessed on their property taxes and then auctioned off to the highest bidder, oftentimes at amounts that the owners could have reclaimed them for if they had been allowed to bid on them, amounts that were actually less than were owed in the overassessed taxes. And on top of that, we're dealing with the loss of dignity that comes from seeing your city, which was a proud majority Black city with the highest rate of Black home ownership in the country, being turned into a majority renter city by 2010, and just now emerging out of that into a majority homeowner city again. And so, these dynamics have really added up over the last 15 years to hollow out a lot of Detroit neighborhoods. And so we see that our own county government at its darkest moment was one of the main entities really sort of predating on Detroit neighborhoods and causing a huge number of lost homes over the years. So now what we're looking at is a city that folks are seeing as ripe for development again. Folks are seeing as ripe for investment after years of active disinvestment. And what that means is we have to do our best to preserve affordability as much as we can, because we know that rents are sky high right now. We know that a lot of the folks who have been driven out of the city by the property tax foreclosure crisis, and before that, the subprime lending crisis, of course, these are folks who in the near future won't be able to buy back into the city, won't be able to call Detroit home again if they wanted to. And so in our neighborhood, what we've done as we see the development moving toward us, the market rate development, as we see the sort of forces of gentrification rearing up, and the displacement piece has already happened with the foreclosures, but now we see the other side of the gentrification with the market rate development on its way. We've turned to the Community Land Trust as that vehicle for both permanent affordability and stability, right? And so, of course, folks we sort of have this myth as far as Black people are concerned, and people of color more broadly, that your home is the major driver of wealth creation for you, right? But what we see time after time is that as neighborhoods become majority Black, the home values in those neighborhoods are artificially deflated, right? The market doesn't value Black people, Black homeowners. And so what we've said is more than a handful of folks building wealth off of these individual homes, our priority is stability for the whole neighborhood. Our priority is getting rid of the vacancy. Our priority is making sure that we can build a vibrant mixed income community, not just that we do only affordable housing in a neighborhood that was already economically depressed, but that we really build something that breaks those strictures of economic segregation, socioeconomic segregation that we all deal with. So for the land trust model, just to sum it up, the goals are purchasing homes, separating the physical property itself from the land that it sits on so that we lower property taxes, and then selling those physical structures, selling those homes so that folks still have home ownership, they're still building equity, but they're making a commitment to share, to split the appreciation with the land trust itself when they're ready to sell. So that they're not saying I'm just in this to cash out in 10 years once everything balloons, but they're saying I'm in this to build a stable community, and I'm in this to make sure that the person who owns this home after me can also attain it at an affordable rate.
And Angie?
Yeah, so Boston's Chinatown, my organization as a community development corporation, so we've been building affordable housing in Boston's Chinatown since the late 80s. And for those of you who might not know Boston well, it is currently a very high cost city in terms of cost of living and rent and just housing cost. And Chinatown, due to its proximity to downtown financial district and a lot of amenities, it has been feeling that pressure of gentrification and displacement closing in on all sides on its borders for the last 10, 15 years. And so housing prices has been going through the roof. And what's interesting about Chinatown is that it is overwhelmingly occupied by renters. The homeownership rate in Chinatown is extremely low. It's something like under 10%. So you can imagine that the renters, especially those who are not living in public housing or affordable housing, they are extremely vulnerable to these pressures. So, for the last 30 plus years, we've been, always working on affordable housing development through new construction. However, in the last couple of years, what we realized is that building new housing and while creating new inventory is very, very important, it does take a long time in terms of permitting, obtaining all the financing, and just putting, stakes in the ground and get it done. It can take several years. Whereas in the meantime, a building can change hands overnight and a new owner can decide to raise the rents and kick everybody out. And there goes your block. So what Annetta was referring to is that we learned from some of our colleagues and other organizations in a couple other cities, in places like California, where there is now this movement towards buying up what's so-called naturally occurring affordable housing. And what that means is that it's a different strategy than the more traditional, creating new affordable housing. Instead, we are going out onto the private market, competing with other buyers and buying up existing privately owned housing. And in doing so, we are preserving the tenancy for the existing residents so that they don't get displaced. So it's really an anti-displacement community preservation strategy. The building that we bought a year ago in Chinatown was a 6-story building. We knew that there were lots of speculators looking at that building. It was, priced to sell. And we knew what was going to happen to the 14 units upstairs. Most of those residents worked in Chinatown, were immigrant workers. And there is a mom and pop longtime Chinese restaurant on the ground floor. We were very, very concerned about what would happen to both the restaurant and the residents upstairs should the building sell to someone else. So Fortunately, the city of Boston and a couple other partners were very, very supportive in us putting together a bid to go after this. And we were very fortunate that we were successful in buying this building. So now we can begin to address some of the deferred maintenance needs, physical needs in the building. But most importantly, we felt good that now we control this building. And so the tenants no longer have to worry about being displaced.
Thank you both. I think both of those are such powerful models. And I'm curious how they are funded. How is the CLT in Detroit funded? How is this recent project, Angie, funded? Mark, let's start with you.
Sure. I mean, we're reliant on the community itself, and we're reliant on philanthropy, frankly. Over the years, DREAM has mainly focused on single-family home rehabs. As we started to staff up in the last year and a half and really make a long-term commitment to this neighborhood that had largely been written off by the planners in the city. But as we've made that commitment, we've started to build a staff and move beyond community funding, seeking support from groups like Enterprise Community Partners and other players in this space. And then, I think when we feel like we're ready, we're also interested in the community real estate investment trust model, whereby, you're sort of crowdfunding investment from local community members to do some commercial development in the area that's driven by the community desires and ultimately community owned. That's a bit premature for us right now. We really need to focus on the housing aspect. And so again, it's community, it's philanthropy to some extent, and building a model around that.
In Boston, in our case, the city was a big partner. They contributed a lot of the funding, and we were also able to get a bridge loan with partnership between Blue Hub Capital and LISC. I think the trickiest part of this transaction was not only pulling together the financing, but that we were working on a deadline, right? The broker said the owners want your best and final offer within, something like a 2 to 3 week period, whereas our normal financing model can take months and months to underwrite. So it took a lot of faith and cooperation among all the other parties to pull this together. And I know in the city of Boston, there are more organizations looking at this model. So I think like in Detroit, there are more philanthropy and foundations looking to put funds into this as well.
So inspiring. Alana, I know you have very strong feelings about the supply side issue that we've just been talking about. So I want to bring in Mel and Alana. You've both been strong voices for community-driven solutions and have powerful examples of this and why this matters. Mel, actually, let's go to you. Tell us about how this plays out in a little bit more greater details in the Native communities.
Sure. One of the things that we have found is that we're creating new institutions. One thing that's been a proliferation and within Native communities are Native CDFIs. And our CDFIs, we've had a report that was done by the Center for Indian Country Development by the Federal Reserve Bank out of Minneapolis that showed that just having a CDFI in your Native community actually increased the credit scores. And it was increasing the credit scores by directly allowing to have like homeownership education, financial capability work, and also being able to provide some of those essential loans and lending that needed to happen in those communities. It's very difficult in tribal areas to get any lending provided. One of the most recent surveys that NeighborWorks does is we have a 2022 NeighborWorks Financial Housing and Financial Capabilities Survey. We survey households to see what their dynamics on and thoughts about homeownership and housing. One of the things is that we found was that 80% of Native Americans who did not own a home did not think that they could get a loan from banks and financial institutions. So that's a huge number. 80% of Native American people just don't think that a bank's going to give them a loan. So what do you do about that? And how do you change those numbers and build confidence? So one of the things that we're doing and I'm very thankful for NeighborWorks America. I came back to housing. I was working independently as an independent consultant, but during the pandemic, huge inequities existed. COVID in my community, the Navajo community, ravaged the community. There's communities in Navajo where all of the elders had passed. And just think about that. All of the elders passing, and things that are so important to Native people is our culture and language. And how can we pass off that culture and language? Is what distincts us as the original inhabitants of this country. But if when you have our elders dying because of overcrowding, there's just not enough houses on reservation land areas for us to live healthily. There's just a severe amount of overcrowding. And that's why COVID was so rampant in our tribal communities. So I came back to housing, and I'm glad at NeighborWorks where they've been able to set up some programming. And one of the programs that we have is called the Lending Systems Focus Group. And we partnered with the Center for Indian Country Development at the Federal Reserve Bank of Minneapolis. But we bring together like lenders, we bring together federal, all the federal agencies that have lending programs that they market and extend to Indian country and focus on tribal members. We all get together, and we also have lender CDFIs, tribal housing programs, tribes, nonprofits, and we have open dialogue about the challenges that are happening just to extend loans. And it's been interesting because at the center point of work with tribes is the tribal trust relationship. And people really don't understand that when tribes gave up their land to the United States and to others, they created a sacred trust relationship with the federal government. And that federal government trust relationship does not stop just at the federal government. It extends to cities, it extends to counties, it extends to municipalities that border reservation areas, and it also extends to all of you. All nonprofit organizations, colleges, and institutions need to actively put in place that trust relationship. And you need to build trustful relationships with tribal communities to look at how can you help them meet the needs of their community, because it's Indian land that we are all standing on today. And so that's the center point of the trust relationship, is how do we create mutually beneficial relationships where we are helping others, but we're also giving back to the original inhabitants of the United States.
Thanks, Mel. And I just want to, you mentioned CDFI. I just want to define CDFI for our audience. Community Development Financial Institution.
Yes.
And yeah, no, trust, it's all about trust. And Alana, I know you're passionate about this issue.
You know, first I just want to say what an honor it is to be on a panel with so many folks who are driving people first solutions that are really rooted in community. I think far too often in conversations about housing, or in the way we're describing this crisis in the mainstream conversations, it's a conversation about widgets. It's how do we build more units without really thinking about what housing really is, who the people are that make up our community, what that means, the rootedness that it facilitates, it allows, and that it can so easily dissolve when we forget about that. Here in Florida, we have more vacant housing units than any other place in the country. And unfortunately, so many of the solutions that are being talked about by our leaders and being pushed by our leaders are about how do we make this pursuit more profitable for for-profit developers to attract them into the market? How do we make this spreadsheet or this pro forma work without a single thought to who is actually going to live in these buildings that we're trying to build? Who are we pushing out by this master plan that we're creating? Who's at the table even getting to comment on these plans? And that, I think we've seen that play out over and over again. And honestly, I've seen with the organizers we work with and the tenant leaders, a built distrust even around the concepts of affordable housing when we don't center communities, right? When folks are really asking, who is this affordable to? Is it affordable to me or to some other community that you're trying to displace me with? And so I think it's so important the models that are being discussed today are rooting in more places, and that we're really centering communities in these solutions first, and letting folks build the solutions so they can maintain the vibrant, incredible communities that we have here in our backyard in Miami and across the country. And I see the conversation really sliding the other way, and I think we really need to fight to keep our folks at the center of it.
Absolutely, Alana, really appreciate those points. So moving to, we're talking about community ownership, we're talking about economic justice. I want to bring in Mark again and Barika to discuss. So building on those points that were just made on people power and community, and community ownership, from an economic justice perspective, why does this matter? And Barika, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, so I think as it weaves in so clearly with some of the things that other folks have said, right? And we talk about and think about here in New York City, no housing is affordable without a job or an income, right? Like we don't in New York City, where we're looking at average 1-bedroom rents of $1,900, and that's like with the naturally occurring lower cost housing that Angie was touching on. If you're in the market, i.e. like online, looking at things like that, it's gonna be more like a $3,000, $3,500 for a 1 or 2 bedroom. This is an incredibly expensive market. And so what we need to be thinking about and understanding is like, what are different ways to structure this, right? I think Alana just touched on this, and really thinking about and understanding that we know that our system is not designed to provide housing for low-income communities, communities of color, immigrant communities, folks who are, right, like this is not, our housing market won't build these units. And so how can we keep, preserve, and create those units ourselves? And so here in New York City, we are trying every tool in the toolbox, and also trying to really create and generate new ideas and understandings of what that looks like. Mark talked about CLTs, Community Land Trusts. Another thing that we're looking at here in New York City is very interesting acronym, Tenant Opportunity to Purchase Act, TOPA. It's a fancy way of saying like a group of tenants coming together and saying, we get to try to buy our building first, as opposed to our landlord turning the building over to somebody else who, as previous people said, are going to increase the rents and sort of kick people out, right? But this ties into economic justice, because we really need to create tools, understanding that so many of our communities are renters, and they're not necessarily going to have these long-term wealth building homeownership opportunities. We want people to be in a place where they don't have to worry about, could my rent increase 20% next year? And we also want them to have an opportunity to accumulate wealth, and especially intergenerational wealth, which is so key and so core to our communities, and is outsized importance for communities of color, who oftentimes mostly build their wealth from their home. And so one of the conversations we're having here in New York City is, how can we think about creating new tools? We don't necessarily have these yet, for how we can say, we're going to take somebody and say, you're a low-income renter, and know that they're going to stay situated as a renter, but also give them both rental stability and a tool to build wealth accumulation over time.
Thank you. And Mark, in Detroit, I know you're not just thinking about housing, you're thinking about the whole person, jobs, transportation, all of that. Talk to us about that and why that's so important as an economic justice framework as well.
Sure. Well, let me just say, with our work with DREAM specifically, we try to say that we're combining community organizing with development to revitalize this neighborhood and build a healthy community. And, for us, the organizing piece is essential to the work as well, because we walked into a situation where, planners working on a 50-year land use framework for our city said this neighborhood should be given away to vacant lots and, shallow pools to collect rainwater runoff, you know what I mean? And so that's it. I mean, I had neighbors who have been here for 4 or 5 generations, not planning to go anywhere. Local institutions that have been here 65 years, that have invested millions just in the last decade in growing their spaces and attracting more people. And so we really had to push back against this narrative that our neighborhood and others like it were dead. And a big part of that was making our residents feel empowered again. So starting our local block club, which grew into a much larger community association, making sure that the mayor's office knew who we were and why we were doing this work and that we're active, making sure that the city council person is at our block club meetings on a regular basis, making sure that other stakeholders are seeing the work that we're doing as more homes get redeveloped and as more neighbors join in the effort. So, combining those things has always been really important for us. The other piece I'll say is, we consider ourselves a faith-inspired organization. We don't call ourselves faith-based. We don't try to deal in exclusivity, but we were started by the local Muslim community, particularly the local Black Muslim community, which has such a strong history here in Detroit, and not just as a faith community, but as a social movement. And one of the quotes from the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, is that he says that the rights of the child of Adam are 3: housing to cover their head, clothing to cover their nakedness, and food and water. And so for us, housing is not just a human right as defined by the Geneva Convention, but a human right going back to the earliest moments of our faith community. And so that's something that we try to lean into to inspire the metro area Muslim community to support an initiative like this. This is a matter of justice. It's a matter of housing justice, racial and economic justice. And on the point you made about transportation, I mean, this is one of the core issues that has really debilitated Detroit, over the last half a century. Of course, we're the Motor City. Of course, we're the automotive capital of the world. We still try to hold on to that title. But what that meant in practical terms is that, we did not invest in mass transit in this region. For generations, we haven't invested in mass transit. We've taken backward steps when it comes to mass transit. And so today we deal with a situation where 70% of the jobs that are accessible to Detroiters, well, let me put it this way, 70% of Detroiters have to leave the city of Detroit to access their jobs. And 70% of the jobs that are actually in the city of Detroit are actually jobs held by suburbanites who have to come into the city to access those jobs. And so we have this huge mismatch. And in most cases, the types of working class jobs that Detroiters are leaving the city to access, they're off the beaten trail. They're jobs that are not easy to get to by bus. There is no train that will get you there, right? And so we live in the city where folks deal with the highest car insurance rates in the country, literally. And the jobs are not in the neighborhoods where we live most regularly. And so this becomes, a huge part of the issue as well. How can we build communities that actually have jobs within walking distance and meaningful work that can support families? And, how do we, looking beyond just the neighborhoods themselves, how do we start to move housing to where some of the current jobs are? How do we convert some of these office buildings, that are more in our downtown and our midtown area into housing units that have substantial amounts of affordable housing units that bring diversity back to those areas that were the first to gentrify in the city? So, these are the types of questions we're dealing with on the trying to match the home ownership, the home affordability crisis with the job crisis.
Yeah, and I would add also, how do we ensure that those communities have the right resources, good schools, social services, etc. I want to take this moment to invite our viewers to please share your questions in the chat. We will have some time at the end of this conversation for your questions. So moving on to tenants, Barika mentioned that not everybody can own a home or wants to own a home, and so we need to be thinking about tenants. I want to bring in Alana again and Angie. So I know that there's groundbreaking tenant organizing and power building happening across the country. In fact, my organization, Chaya, founded the first South Asian tenant union in the country with the Bangladeshi Tenant Union. And certainly we have a long road ahead of us to ensure that tenant protection and rights, that there's adequate tenant protection and rights across this country. In both of Boston and where you are, Alana, give us some examples of what you're seeing in the tenant space. And let's start with Alana.
Sure. So, I mean, again, I think there's incredibly powerful tenant movements and have for a long time been here in the Deep South, although they may not get as much attention as some of our peers and colleagues across the country. We had colleagues, a coalition of incredible folks, including Florida Rising, in the county, Orange County, where Orlando is here in Florida, get on the ballot, rent stabilization, win it by an incredible majority, had people, the only reason they came out to vote was to say yes to this. And polling found more than 8 in 10 likely voters supported it, and the ballot bared that out, only to have, again, corporate interests come and throw wrenches into the implementation of that, and ultimately change the law so that wasn't able to be implemented. And we've also seen at the local level, folks fight for things like offices of the housing advocate, implementing in-house in local government advocacy, or offices to support landlord accountability, and actually just changing basic principles of what it means to interact with your landlord, requiring things like a notice of rights, requiring more time before you can raise rent, 60 days instead of 2 weeks. Before landlords can raise rent, and just all sorts of innovative ideas that are small, no-cost things that really create the opportunities for housing stability. And we're seeing huge pushback to this from landlord and realtors associations and other lobbyist groups and PACs. But what I think is incredible about working with organized groups of community is those setbacks have not stopped this movement, and they're not going to. I think if anything, they've really politicized folks to understand we need to fight. We need to fight harder. We need to build bigger tents to bring in more of our neighbors to keep this fight up. And I think we're learning from folks across the country and across the South to keep doing that work.
Angie.
Yeah, I would say that, certainly the pandemic has exacerbated many of these housing issues over the last couple of years. So I think housing and tenant advocates have been fighting on so many different fronts over the last few years. The first couple of years early on the pandemic, it was really to make sure that there was eviction moratoriums on the state level. And unfortunately, that did not last as long as we liked. But the state of Boston and a few other smaller cities did maintain longer eviction moratoriums. I heard a couple other, Barika and Alana mentioned a couple of similar bills that we're also seeing having a lot of traction at the state level here as well. There's TOPA, the tenant option to purchase private housing. That already had a lot of momentum a few years ago. It didn't quite make it to the finish line last year. There is still a lot of momentum for it, but we are seeing a lot of pushback from the real estate industry. In the city of Boston, the mayor has filed, in case you don't know, Massachusetts is a home rule petition state. So the city can't do a lot of things on its own. It requires the approval of the full state legislature. So rent stabilization is one of those that needs to make it past the state house in order to take effect. So that rent stabilization proposal would not only put a cap on annual rent increases, but just as importantly, it would enact certain tenant protections, including just cause eviction clauses. And the real estate industry has spent quite a lot of money on a PR campaign to fight this tooth and nail.
Thank you, Angie. That's super helpful, and I'm really glad that you mentioned the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, and of course there was also the Homeownership Assistance Fund, and both of these, I think many of us really feel that both of these should be permanent sources of support, and Right. So clearly there's a lot of work to be done there. I want to shift to wealth creation and homeownership, going back to some of the points made earlier by many of you. Oh, Mel, you're back. Great. We lost you for a second. Wonderful. Okay, so I want to bring in actually three of you, Barika, Mark, and Mel. Barika, I recall you saying, going back to this thing that if you're not a homeowner, you're left out of the wealth building opportunity. And Mark, your work is, again, primarily around homeownership. And Mel, you talk about high and middle income Native folks leaving reservations and what that does to the communities. So homeownership and wealth creation is clearly a big, an important area in housing justice. So let's talk about some ways you are each working on this issue. And let's start with Mel.
I hope this works.
I think Mel seems to be having some connectivity issues. So why don't we go to Barika? We'll come back to you, Mel.
Okay. I think some of the ways that we're thinking about this, some people have touched on them, but I think I think first and foremost, we want this to be options and opportunities for individuals, families, and communities, right? That folks should be able to elect to stay renters and build wealth, or elect to be homeowners and build wealth, and to also be able to choose where they're living in any one of those situations or scenarios. And I think Mark spoke on this earlier, but thinking about mixed income communities. If I'm in, you talked about Jackson Heights, Annetta, or if I'm in Crown Heights, Brooklyn, or if I'm in the South Bronx, I should have the opportunity to say, I'm going to go from being a renter to transitioning to be a homeowner without the assumption and the need and only option being leaving your neighborhood and leaving your community, right? And I think that's unfortunately too often what we're finding. And especially in New York City, that often means not just leaving your neighborhood and community or leaving your borough. It often means leaving New York City altogether, and sometimes leaving New York State. And so people are really making incredibly difficult and tough decisions about what they have to consider in order to be in a position to build wealth and potentially achieve homeownership. I also think this is one of the places where we are seeing the overwhelming reality of the racial wealth gap and how that plays out, right? And I think that this is sort of causing us to really consider and contemplate and grapple with income levels very differently. Because here in New York City, what we would consider middle income Black communities, Bangladeshi communities, our Dominican communities, what we would consider middle income, are actually being shut out of the homeownership market, and they're outside of where they can access homeownership assistance via many of our traditional programs and systems, right? They're sort of like beyond the place where they'll qualify for some of our down payment assistance programs or some of these other pieces. So I think we've got to really try to understand how policy is intersecting with people's lives. And then quickly, the other thing that I would say is that the homeownership market kind of needs to catch up with how families actually operate and live. And I know, Annetta, you and I were touching on this in conversation earlier. Many of us haven't ever had like a nuclear family setup, right? It's not just like the parents and then children. There was aunties and cousins and sisters, whoever it was that came through that needed a place to stay. That was a part of who was in your home and in your community. And that's oftentimes how we built the ability to own homes. And so also building homeownership and housing that really fits those family dynamics, and recognize that that's the structure sometimes for many of the folks who are engaging in the housing market and really many of our population now.
I so appreciate you making that point, and I feel so passionately about that. For example, in my community, there's a tremendous need for intergenerational housing. Let's go to Mel, since he's back, before we lose him.
Sure. What's the question again?
Yeah, so it's this question. You had mentioned that middle and high income folks are leaving the reservation, right? And we talked about the importance of homeownership and wealth creation, and so I wanted you to talk a little bit more about like why is that so important.
It's really important because I was talking earlier about the low-income housing programs that are provided through the federal government and NAHASDA and the Indian Housing Block Grant. Those programs target families that are 80% of AMI, the average median income for their area. But when we get above 80%, there's large communities in rural areas don't have any other housing options. There's no open market for homeownership and housing stock. And so we are losing a lot of our folks that go off to college and want to come back and work in the community, but get a job and they are above that income threshold. We have the very real needs that for example, we may have a clinic that just opened and we have a great clinic that's open, but how are we going to recruit nurses and doctors if we don't have homes that they can live in and buy and even rent? And so we do have this kind of brain drain effect that's happening in our communities. I hate to use brain drain effect because we know that that's where I just don't like to use that term, but I think that we really need to create more options. And so one of the things that we're doing is I really like this work that's being done where coalitions are taking initiatives at the local level. In South Dakota, there's the South Dakota Native Homeownership Coalition, and they work closely with their federal partners, tribal partners, state partners. And one of the things that they were able to do was to create a relending program. They worked with the USDA's 502 single family relending program. And they what they did is instead of individual families taking out the 502 loans, they took out the loan and then relended those loans out to the community. And USDA, the hardworking people there, they worked really hard, but for the last decade, they had less than 10 loans in those communities. By just doing this relending program through the Community Development Financial Institutions, the CDFI, they were able to increase the number of loans within 2 years. So 19 loans within 2 years. Over the previous decade, there was only 10 loans, less than 10 loans. So I think that, again, it goes back to finding creative solutions to create, to address some of those challenges. And I'm very thankful that you all included me into this conversation because often tribal issues are completely forgotten and invisible in the larger conversation related to housing.
Thank you, Mel. Mark, is there anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll jump in really quickly. Just you mentioned the Homeowners Assistance Fund, and in Michigan we called it My Half as they programmed it, the Michigan Homeowners Assistance. A fund that let me just say that we had to advocate to get our state housing and development authority to make these funds accessible to folks who had property tax dating back more than 3 years. We had to do call-in days. We had to do letter writing. We had to put pressure on our local members of Congress to put pressure on U.S. Treasury so that Michigan State Housing Development Authority would make those funds available. And when it was really just an administrative decision from the beginning that they didn't. So this is why we try to make sure that while we're doing the development work, that there's an organizing side as well. We work with a group called the Coalition for Property Tax Justice here in Detroit, which has been on the front lines of solving the property tax crisis. And this was just something I wanted to mention. This is why for us, these things really go hand in hand. We were doing hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of rehabs before we finally said, we can't just be doing these individual single family homes one by one, raising all this money. We've got to be working on the systemic issues that have hollowed out our neighborhoods. When it comes to homeownership and wealth building, I'll just go back to what I mentioned earlier. For us, the biggest priority is stability. It's stability of the overall neighborhood. So that the homeowners have some insulation and so that the folks who have been hanging on the longest have an opportunity to stay in their home, to age in their home, to live in Detroit the rest of their lives if that's what they want to do without being priced out now. So many neighborhoods in our city have dealt with falling values for decades at this point, have dealt with growing vacancies for decades. And now that we're seeing real turnarounds in pockets, it isn't everywhere yet, but now that we're seeing real turnarounds, I mean, to go back to a term by a group called the Black Bottom Collective here out of Detroit, we're telling people, hang on till hope comes. Like, you waited this long, you sustained the city, you stayed here while other people were abandoning it or being pushed out. You fought back to stay. Hang on till hope comes. The property values are coming back for some of you. Don't miss that opportunity. But we try to say that while being cognizant that, again, and large, we see what happens when neighborhoods become majority Black and how that artificially depresses the values. And for us, the biggest priority is stability, and like I said, long-term permanent affordability.
Thank you, Mark. Okay, now we're going to move to our audience for questions. So a question came in for Mel. Is there federal legislation that we can support to address funding for Native housing?
So I work at NeighborWorks America. We can't advocate for any kind of legislation, but I do think that the Native American Housing Assistance and Self-Determination Act is it's been passed in since the early 90s, and the work of that legislation to bring about the ability for tribes to have their own self-determined choices of how their housing programs are being implemented into their community has worked. The difficult part is we continue to look at the straining resources, the federal resources that go to that program, and the fact that it's been flatlined for a number of years. We have to look at how we leverage those funds, and so I think we need to be more creative and looking at how do we leverage federal funds in our communities and think of the creative ways, like the South Dakota Native Homeownership Coalition. There's 2 other coalitions in other states. There's local things that are happening at the ground level. And, the renter assistance program, the homeowner assistance program, all of these things are being successfully implemented in tribal communities if they're given a chance. That's the point.
Mm-hmm. And Mel, you had also mentioned expansion of CDFIs, that every community should have a CDFI.
Oh, yeah.
Which I think is really important to underscore.
That's the great thing about CDFIs, is that they can build strategies that connect directly with tribal housing authorities, with the schools and institutions, with tribal colleges and universities. It's a great way to leverage the work of CDFIs as a lending institution and building that wealth that's needed and that financial capability work that's needed in tribal communities.
Thank you. And so the next question is about renters and homeownership. What can renters do to begin to look into homeownership? And Angie, I think you might have a good answer for that question, but so why don't we start with you and then open it up to anybody else who might want to comment on that?
Sure. So in addition to building affordable housing, our organization also runs a program called Building Blocks, which is focused on building financial literacy as well as offering homeownership education. So across the country, there are HUD certified housing counseling agencies that offer homeownership education, especially if you never owned a home before. And I know since COVID, there are many more of these organizations that are offering these classes online, so they don't necessarily have to be in person if you don't live close to one of them. I think in addition to that education, looking into building credit, things like that. And in different states and different cities, there are likely various down payment assistance programs and special, more incentives or better rates programs that are for first-time homeowners. So definitely look into that. In the city of Boston, there are down payment assistance as well as match savings programs targeting at first-gen homeowners and really targeting people of color. So I would say look into those programs.
Annetta, if I could just
Yeah.
If I could just add one thing onto what Angie said, which is all of what Angie said. And for the moment in time when you think, we hear this all the time, when you're the renter and you're thinking about home ownership, don't wait to get all of your stuff in order and then go to all the resources that Angie talked about. Do it the moment that it comes across your mind, because it takes a while to get there. You want to go through these processes. Like, go ahead and get the support as you're going through the journey. Don't wait until you're like, I've got my whole house in order and then I'm going to go talk to somebody. Like, do it the moment it starts. I think sometimes we hear like people are like, well, I'm about a year out. We're like, no, go now. So that's the other thing. I feel all of us are like, yes, please just go as soon as it comes up.
Great. Okay, so our next question is, this has been a wonderful conversation about many issues around affordable and accessible housing. Another issue is provision of safe housing, especially for renters, but this can also be an issue for homeowners who cannot afford to make needed repairs to maintain a safe living environment. Please comment. I'm so glad that this question came in. This is so important. Ultimately, this is about keeping homeowners in their home, preventing foreclosure. And we've seen in many of our communities here in New York City, we've seen a precipitous decline among Black homeowners who've lost their homes because of inability to take care or to afford some of these, what can be minor costs. So who would like to comment on that?
I mean, I'll just quickly say, in Detroit, and well, let me say, in a neighborhood like ours, we're dealing with 100-year-old houses, and many times frame houses. Because of the way development happened in the region, there were no new properties built in the city for a long time, and so you're dealing with a particularly old housing stock. So these types of repair programs are absolutely necessary. Our city used some ARPA funding to make homeowner repair funds accessible, working with local social service agencies on the deployment of those dollars. We've had some philanthropic support, won't mention any particular foundations, but some that have stepped up to offer more relief and to create multi-million-dollar funds. But even a $20 million homeowner repair fund goes overnight. And, we've got 7,000 people on a waiting, 7,000 households on a waiting list right now. And there's talks of getting more money into that fund, but nothing's been committed yet necessarily. So, this is a major issue, on par with the rest of the housing crisis itself, the whole affordability crisis itself. So I think it's something that's going to require, federal intervention to get the type of resource, the scale of resources we need to actually address preserving the homes that we do own.
Thank you, Mark. And so one last question, and then we'll come back to you all for your final comments. The question is, please speak about the housing laws, if any, that prevent renters from being thrown out of their rented apartments to fix some issues and are never let back into the space. And so that probably differs in the different states and municipalities. Alana, why don't I ask you to comment on that? And then if you don't mind keeping the comment brief, because we're getting close to time. Thank you.
For sure. Yeah, I think that's right. The laws differ, and I think we need to keep fighting for stronger ones. I know Just Fix in New York is a model that we look to from down here in Florida, incredible resource. After Surfside here in Florida, folks fought for landlord accountability so that the demolition by neglect and letting these conditions fester can't be a leading business model. But it's a huge problem.
Okay. Thank you to our audience for those questions. So to come back to close out our conversation, I'd like to ask each of you, we've discussed, some of the most pressing issues that we are grappling with as a country as it relates to housing and economic justice. And this is hard work, and it's so complex. And I think sometimes it's easy to lose faith and lose hope. But I know you're all in it because you believe that a different world is possible. We're all in it. I'm in it because I believe a different world is possible. So I want to just maybe start with Mark and ask each of you to tell me what gives you hope.
Hmm. I mean, who wants to live in despair? I agree with you when you say that a different world is possible, and I think our commitment to that is what keeps us going. Of course, in organizing spaces, one of the common phrases you hear is right, like the world as it is, and the world as it could be, or the world as it should be. Some people say, and so for us, it's about being real about the reality that we encounter and the choices that forces us to make and the sort of decisions that we have to make in the short term, while always having a big picture in mind, while always having our values up front and having big aspirations for living in a world of just communities, living in a world where housing truly is a recognized human right, living in a world where folks have those basic needs that they can then launch their lives for as they try to reach their greatest potential. So it's just about wanting to make a difference in these neighborhoods and neighborhoods like these. For me in Detroit, all Detroiters, we've been beat down not just by the country, but even by like our region. So we all have this like underdog thing going on. So for me, it's about Detroit and what we can do for our city and the people who've made this city. So there's a lot to keep us hopeful. So thank you for asking that question.
Yeah, and I'm just going to ask the rest of us to keep our comments very brief because we only have 2 minutes left. Angie.
Sure. I think what gives me hope, the greatest sense of hope, is the people who we work alongside. And I'm not just talking about staff, volunteers, board members, or whatnot. It's the residents in Chinatown who work side by side with us. It's our young people, our high school age youth. They can't even vote yet. They can't even drive yet. Yet they are going to community meetings with us, voicing their opinions, fighting for housing justice, fighting for their community survival. So when I see our residents who are immigrants and our youth who are the children and grandchildren of these immigrants, I really get inspired and I have a lot of hope.
Mel.
Sure. I think one of the essence of being about tribal communities is their culture and language. And what gives me hope is to see Native people being able to return to their homelands, to learn and attend institutions, K through 12, providing education in their own tribal language. And I just saw this last week, our tribal college, the first tribal college to have a PhD program. And that's amazing. When we really think about wealth in our communities, it takes on a different look in each community. But to tribal communities, even one thing like having your own tribal college where you can send your children close to home, that's wealth to us. And I'm glad that we're building wealth in the communities. And I'm just inspired by our young people. They're coming back, and they're coming back to the reservation, and they're coming back to the reservation.
I'm so sorry. We are at time. Oh. So I apologize, Alana and Barika, but thank you all so much for this incredible conversation. And I've learned so much and feel inspired. Oh, I've been told I can go ahead actually and hear from Barika and Alana. Oh, thank you, moderators or tech folks.
We'll speak quickly. I have the incredible privilege of getting to work with organizers and tenant leaders every day, elders who have been through worse fights than the worst one I've seen, and young people who have a fire in their belly that, brings us back to center. And if you have a tenant union, if you have a worker center neighborhood, join it. If you don't, find one way to support one in your area or one in a place close to your heart. I think that drive for a better world, that community vision to really create a beloved community is what brings me hope and keeps us going.
Barika.
What brings me hope is I have the pleasure and fortune of getting to work with folks like who are on here across all of New York City, some 80 plus organizations, including Aneta and the awesome team at Chaya, And I think it's really an understanding of like what we can do and the power that the community power that we can build when we come together, right? Like, yes, this is about individual people and their homes and their families, but it's really about what we can do as a collective and the movement and the power shifts that we can make when we really come together and try to think about shifting and transforming systems.
Beautiful. And I'll just share, for me, for as long as our people believe, our community members believe, and they have hope and they are fighting, that gives me hope. Thank you all so very much. This was amazing.
Thank you.
And Brian.
Hey, thank you guys. This was just really incredible. Such an honor to hear from you. So much wisdom and experience and caring in the room. Very, very informative. A great way to start this 5-week summit. I want to say and thank you, Anetta, for that masterful moderating. You were especially great too. And thank you, Mahogany, for that powerful reading at the top of the program. I want to say a quick thank you again to our promotional partners, Chaya, CDC, Dream of Detroit, Community Justice Project, the Asian Community Development Corporation, the Association for Neighborhood and Housing Development, and NeighborWorks America. On behalf of everyone here at the WNET Group, a big thanks to all of you for joining us tonight. We hope you'll return on next Wednesday, for part 2, which is A Circle Made of Soil, a town hall about food sovereignty and security. Learn more at 13.org/close to home. Take care of each other. Take care of yourselves. Have a great night. We'll see you in a week.